storyteller who has contributed to various programs across the country. He graduated from Harvard College with a Bachelor of Arts in Government History. He attended the Pre-Law Summer Institute for American Indians and Alaska Natives in 2023, and now is in his final semester of law school at Georgetown University. He plans to continue working in federal Indian law in Washington, D.C. after graduation. Eli is one of the featured Coushatta artists selected for the exhibition Homelands upstairs, where he has contributed the art of storytelling to the larger narrative of contemporary Indigenous art showcased within the exhibition. Please join me in welcoming Eli Langley.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Eli. So I come from a small town in southwest Louisiana called Elton, Louisiana. It's got like 1,000 people in it. So on a good day. So it's mostly farmers, and the Coushatta Reservation is just outside of the town. And most of the people that live in this town are farmers, or they work on the oil fields, or various things like that. But there's also this, I sometimes think of it like an appendage, and there's the Coushatta Tribe also, affixed to this community. And we have been in southwest Louisiana since at least the early 20th century, but we actually originate from the Tennessee River Valley. We were situated along the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers for hundreds of years. Hernando de Soto found us there in the 1500s, and that was the earliest record of contact between us and Europeans. So that is one reason why I felt that it was so cool and significant to be able to contribute to an exhibition like Homelands, because these literally are my tribe's homelands. And there are no, unless I'm misremembering, there are no longer any federally recognized tribes in Tennessee. So the ability for tribes like mine and artists to be able to come and contribute to an exhibit like this and to share some of our culture with the place where we come from, it's a special opportunity. So I think of tonight in a similar vein. So thank you all for being here. So growing up, my first language was English. And my father, who was, I'd say he's 2 generations removed from me. He was about 47 when I was born. And he and other members of our tribe around his age grew up speaking Koasati, our tribal language, as their first language. So when my father went to school, he and the other Koasati school children were sent to I think it was a BIA school on the reservation, that's Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they set up a school in and around the local Indian church. And I think the kids were really glad that they had a local school for the first time in this really poor, sort of remote area. Elton itself is already poor and desolate, so a tribal reservation outside of Elton is like lower than low at that point. And he has vivid memories of speaking the language whenever he was in class or with some of his cousins and being reprimanded for it, sometimes physically, and just suffering as a result of trying to continue speaking his language. So he used to tell me a story about not knowing the difference between yes and no. He knew the words yes and no, but didn't know which one meant which. So if you've ever had like a hall monitor or someone like that, where the teacher leaves the room and somebody sits there and tells on whoever was talking whenever they come back. One day my dad was put in this position, and I think all the students in the class were cutting up, and she could hear them in the hallway. And so she's coming back, and his name is Eli Langley. So she said, "Bert, was anybody talking whenever I left the class? Like, I gave you this job to watch out for people." And he said, "No." And then he got punished for like a week for this, and had no idea why, because he didn't know what no meant. So stories like that were circulating around in his generation and in prior generations. So by the time I was born in '98, a lot of the elders in the community had come around to the idea that it might be more beneficial to teach the tribal children English as a first language, to give us a better chance in school and the ability to leave the reservation at certain points in our lives, and not to have as much of an uphill battle as they did. And honestly, I never feel any kind of consternation about this decision, because you can understand it from their perspective, suffering as a result of this language, and not being able to do the kinds of career things that they might have otherwise done. It really left a serious kind of wound in the tribe. So it was somewhat intentional, but also, it's hard to teach a language whenever only one parent speaks it, and whenever the outside world is completely in English. There are no resources for these things outside of the community. So I grew up hearing Koasati, but not speaking it. And my mother also didn't speak the language. So my sister and I grew up not speaking the language, but being surrounded by it. So we were really familiar with the sounds of the language. Like we have a lot of memories of growing up and listening to elders say things that we couldn't understand for hours, just sitting in their houses and just always feeling like there was some kind of disconnect, there was some kind of missing piece. And so you kind of grow up in a rural community, and you go outside and you play in the bayou, and you play in the forest and those sorts of things. So I had a pretty typical rural upbringing in that sense. But I remember feeling very early on in my life, whenever I went to public school in Elton, that there was something about me that people couldn't quite categorize or couldn't quite fit into a particular box. And so I started getting in trouble at school, I think for having a lot of energy and being kind of rambunctious and having, just little patience for some of the typical schooling things. I think a lot of young boys go through that sort of thing. I think it's as close to a universal experience as you can really have. But I always remember feeling like there was some kind of tension between my home life and this outside world we call the white world. And never knowing quite why that was, or what it was about me that wasn't exactly palatable or wasn't exactly championed in those sorts of environments. But I would go to my grandma's house, or work with grandma's apple. So I would spend a lot of time with my apple, and the thing I remember most about this period, this really early period of my life, is that she never discouraged me from, doing typical outside things or being a little boy. And I just always felt like there was some kind of recognition that it's okay not to be categorizable. Like that's the thing I felt most from her and from other members of my family growing up, is you're never going to fully fit in because you come from an insular community with its own language, its own culture, and even if you don't speak the language, there's still cultural values and things that will kind of clash at times. So very early on in my life, this kind of dichotomy was sort of set up for me, even just my normal living experience and my day-to-day life, between my culture on one end and professional achievement on the other. And so that's kind of why I titled this talk the way I did. And when I was thinking about my life in preparation for this, I thought that's sort of the central tension in my life, is feeling like I wanted to perform well in school and pursue a typical professional career, and really being invested in cultural preservation. And I think in a lot of Indian activist spaces and a lot of cultural preservation spaces, it's hard not to really fall into this dichotomy because it seems obvious. Excuse me, if your culture and your language is not necessarily, these are not skills that you would necessarily use in a professional context, then how can learning your language and preserving your culture contribute to your professional development? And it's not an obvious answer. So I'm still kind of dealing with it to this day, but I just always felt there's some way to bridge these two things. There's some way to lessen the divide, and maybe they can be mutually reinforcing. So, as I'm growing up, my parents, my mom, Dr. Linda Langley, my father, Bertney Langley. My mom was an anthropologist. She went to Harvard and Brown. She's from Boston, first generation American, and her and my father met in the 80s, working with the Narragansett tribe in Rhode Island. My mom was doing research, and my dad was like a healthcare consultant, helping them fix their healthcare program. And this is early days of the re-recognition era, following the termination era. It's like a lot of American Indian history that you guys might research more at your own time without me, explaining all of it. But there was something that my parents felt was really important about the culture and the language of the Coushatta Tribe. And it was not as fashionable to think about languages disappearing, I guess, at the time, or it wasn't as in vogue to talk about that sort of thing. But they knew that they wanted to do cultural preservation together. So my mom came back to Louisiana, and they started a family And I think my mom's perspective was really important in this whole language project and heritage program because it was good to have an outsider from the tribe, an outsider's perspective, to look at sort of the progression of our culture and our language over time and notice patterns that are not as obvious whenever you're inside the bubble. So when I was young, it would have been 2005 or so, one day my mother says to my father, "Your language is dying." And he's like, "What are you talking about, lady?" He was like, "I speak this language every day. I speak it on the phone, I speak it to my mother, my sister, my cousins, all these other people. Because people his age in the tribe, they speak the language every day. And whenever you're in that kind of situation, it doesn't seem like your language is dying. That doesn't really make sense to a person." So she said, "Okay, I get why you're hesitant to accept this, but," she said, "think about," I have a half sister who's like 20 years older than me. She said, "Think about whenever you call Janine on the phone, and or any other person around her age, one generation below you, and you speak to them in Koasati, they will understand you, but they will respond to you in English." And he kind of stopped him in his tracks. And he was like, "That is true." And that is actually one of the most common signs that a language is in decline. Even if there's sort of like a liminal stage sometimes, even if people are speaking the language every day and fluently, if you can understand but not yourself produce the language, then you're already kind of going down a downward slope and you're producing fewer speakers or no speakers at all. So all these processes are happening in my young life, and my parents are reckoning with this and stuff, and we started going to conferences around the Southwest and observing other tribes who were down sometimes to their last speaker. I don't know if anyone's ever had the experience of meeting someone who's the last speaker of an ancient language. It's amazing. And my mother and my father had the chance to talk with several people that were in this position and watch recordings of them and talk to the people in the community who were left trying to pick up the pieces when these people passed. And it's devastating to lose your language. There is no sugarcoating it. It doesn't mean that languages can't be revived. If the last speaker dies, there's famous examples of that happening in Massachusetts and other places, but it's very difficult to bring the language back whenever the last speaker dies. So seeing those people and talking to them and feeling the weight of their experience and the sorrow that they felt, personal pressure and cultural pressure and community pressure, it's like there's just not enough time to talk to a last speaker enough to get all of their information and to hear all of their stories and to learn everything they know. It's just not possible. So every time a speaker of an endangered language dies, more of the language goes with them. It's like losing a dictionary or encyclopedia or something. So all these things are kind of weighing on my dad, and he's starting to finally, I think, accept that our language was starting to go down this path. In the early 2000s, Koasati I think we estimated this like 300 speakers, which is really nice for a language as small as ours. We often feel like we have a lot of speakers compared to other tribes who are in more difficult situations, but it's still vanishingly small number of speakers in like a global languages context. So it might be even fewer now, maybe 200 now. We don't keep up-to-date data on this, but I'm 27 and I'm one of the youngest speakers of the language. And it's not, sometimes people think that I'm saying that to pat myself on the back. I'm really saying that to encourage younger people to take the title from me. I don't want to be the youngest speaker of this language. It's heavy to be that. It's heavy to feel that pressure. But showing people that it's possible to learn a language that is as undocumented, in the past and has as few resources as Koasati, to be able to learn it at all it was sort of a mindset shift for my tribe in some ways. But so this is all in its infancy in the early 2000s. We ended up getting a lot of federal grants, like from the NSF, or Google was doing an endangered languages program at that time too. So we started getting some funding and we started working. My mother had various connections with academics in the language preservation space, like Dr. Jack Martin, who was crucial in our story. And so they all started getting together and thinking about what we might do to counteract this decline. And I think something that's important to remember about languages is, and any linguist will tell you this, anybody really who speaks more than one language can tell you this, it's not just a cute novelty where you make different sounds and you get the same meaning. Language encodes worldview and culture and relational concepts and lived experience and ways of thinking about the world that are not fully translatable. If you've ever listened to a song in another language, you will know that it's impossible to fully one-to-one translate the meaning and the emotion and all of the context from one language to another. So, not even counting like oral family history or our traditional rabbit tales, which I was also kind of brought up learning these stories and being trained in the art of storytelling because my father told stories and his father and my great grandfather and a lot of the men in our family had done this. So the challenge that we faced whenever we first started the language project was that there actually was documentation of the language in the 20th century. There are great linguists and ethnographers like Mary Haas and John Swanton, and later Jeffrey Kimball and other people had come to the community and they had done field work basically on our language and recorded stories and tried to do linguistics and various things like that. But the issue with these materials, and it's really good that we have a lot of these because without some of these field notes, a lot of the things that are in them we would never have preserved at all. So I'm grateful that they exist. But there is a gap between field work that produces materials that's legible in academia and information and materials that can be used by community members themselves. A lot of times the difficulty is simply in how complex certain linguistic glosses are, or someone might have an idiosyncratic notes-taking style, or papers might get damaged, or any other number of problems might come up for those kinds of materials. But they are, like I said, also extremely valuable in preserving things that might not have otherwise been preserved. But we had to think, how can we translate these materials that already exist, or how can we make our own materials such that we might be able to teach our children and create community programs and start immersion classes and do all the kinds of things that an endangered language needs to do to revitalize itself. And so my mother and my father started the Heritage Department and the language program of the tribe, I think in 2005. And we got together a group of elders and we called them the Language Committee. And we made shirts. I still have my small kid-sized shirt of the Language Committee. And got all of our elders together in rooms over weekends or at other times and fed them and tried to make them comfortable and brought linguists like Jack Martin in. And Jack was wonderful for a lot of different reasons. But the thing that was most important about what Jack Martin brought to the project was that he showed us that there was sort of a new paradigm in the social sciences or in the linguistics field where it wasn't the case that academics only wanted to go to communities to extract information from them and to publish under their own name or to advance their academic careers. Or some people may have had, and I think a lot of people probably did have, good intentions going to tribes and trying to record and document some of their materials. But good intentions don't always lead to positive outcomes in the end. So even if people went in intending to do things that were good, if the tribe leaves all of these interactions having nothing in their hand, it certainly leaves a bad taste in one's mouth that we had no access to any of the materials. They were owned by universities. We're like, this is our language. You do not know the language if we don't tell it to you. You can't own our language. You can't own materials and sell materials and profit on your documentation of our language while we have nothing to teach our children. It feels like more of an insult than maybe it was intended to be, but that was the situation we found ourselves in. And the thing that was so beautiful about Jack and our collaboration with him was that he was like, the paradigm can be different now. I don't need to publish anything under my name. I don't need to be paid for this work, which was honestly insane. He was willing to do as much work as he did without ever, being incentivized that way. But he was totally willing and able to allow us to lead the project and allow us to set the terms of the collaboration. And the thing that was, like I've been kind of alluding to, that was most important in all this is that we were like, we want to own the materials that we produce. The Coushatta Tribe of Louisiana has to own the trademark and own all of the copyright protections and all those other things for these materials so that we can use them however we want. And of course, he was comfortable with that. We all felt really good about that. And in the early 2000s and around this time period, a lot of different tribes were kind of setting out on this road towards doing some more substantive language preservation. So things happened really quickly. I have memories of being 6, 7 years old and sitting in a room over a weekend and watching the language committee and elders and first speakers create an alphabet in 2 days. And the language had never been written down by the tribe before. I mean, we never had a script. Other tribes choose to create their own scripts that are more different than Latin scripts. And that's perfectly valid. You know, every tribe can do whatever they want, but we decided to adapt the typical Latin alphabet into Koasati phonemes and various things like that. I'm not going to get really technical into linguistics, but just to give a sense of the pace. In a weekend, we had the alphabet. In a summer, we had a dictionary, a phrase book, a teaching grammar. We were producing children's stories, like we did Clifford the Big Red Dog. We translated into Koasati. We did funny things like translating movie clips, like from Crocodile Dundee, or like other, you know, older movies, and figuring out how to say some of the catchphrases in Koasati. So I always had fun doing that kind of thing. I've always the Joker, and we did a Dark Knight thing like many years later. And so I always thought that was fun. And a lot of tribes now end up like integrating pop culture or various things. Like I've seen people make pottery of like R2D2 or like various things like that. I think all that stuff is cool. I'm in favor of that. I think anything that you can do to kind of increase young people's interest in these endeavors, you know, and make it more fun, I think is a good way to get people in the door. But so this is rapid fire. You know, by the time I was 10 years old, we had produced, from having nothing before, we had produced enough to start teaching young people in a more consistent way. So throughout all this time, obviously, I'm kind of just there. Like I helped however I could. I remember the interesting thing about developing an alphabet and these teaching materials yourself, like with your community in real time, is that I didn't realize this then, but it makes sense now. My generation was the first to be able to read and write the language. And that makes a huge, huge difference for preservation, because oral languages are wonderful. I mean, that was what we had for our entire existence, but not being able to write things down, it just makes preservation almost impossible. So we were happy to have an alphabet and a script that we could text. I texted my dad a lot in it. We sent emails in it. We started writing, you know, obviously we had the dictionary and all those other materials. But people started incorporating it, you know, in their day-to-day life, in ways that they communicate with their family members, and I always felt really good about that, because it's already hard enough to learn endangered languages and do this preservation stuff. But if everything in your life is siloed from language preservation, then you have to, you know, open all these padlocks and, you know, go through a bunch of different layers of difficulty to get into language preservation. It makes it harder to do it day to day. It makes it harder to be consistent about it. So we thought the less friction that we could put in the front end for people to get involved and to learn themselves, the better. And so that was kind of our thought process as we went into it. And we made a very explicit decision at a certain point that we didn't want the language committee to be, like, I'll use French as an example, and no offense to the French Association, but like I don't know what it's called, but there's a board of like French Academy or whatever, and they set standards for the language that kind of trickles down, and especially in a language that's more oral like ours, and where there are differences in pronunciation between families and different regions, different geographic locations would pronounce things differently and stuff. We didn't want to be so top down with how we were formalizing these materials, so we would sometimes put different pronunciations for different words in the dictionary. We would make notations if one family said something one way, one the other. If we ever did audio portions, we would have multiple people who pronounce things differently give their renditions and things like that. We really adopted a sort of descriptive as opposed to prescriptive mindset about these things, and I think that's paid off over time, because the thing that we didn't want to do, And anyone who's ever grown up in a small community or rural community knows how easy it is to turn things that should be housekeeping into like feuds, like between factions or family members or cousins or whatever. And we were like trying to avoid that to the extent that we could. And we didn't want people to think that there was only one right way of speaking Koasati. And even now, whenever I speak to members of my community, they often tell me, "You sound just like your dad." And it makes sense, obviously, because he's the one that taught me more than anyone else. But he had a pretty idiosyncratic way of speaking, and our family did too. So I often think about that just to keep myself humble in my presentation about my way of speaking the language. And a lot of languages are like this, where differences, they're not the same as one being superior to the other. So I don't know. I learned a lot in this process, and it took up pretty much all of my young life. And I actually went to boarding school at the age of 12. So when I was 12, at some point, I came home to my parents and I said, I really don't think that there is enough here for me educationally. And my mom obviously was shocked and horrified and, in tears and things like that. And my dad was really interesting in this whole situation because he was really strict on me as a kid. And still, there was something about what I was saying where he couldn't just dismiss me out of hand, like this is another one of Eli's harebrained schemes or something. Like, I made a PowerPoint. I remember that. All the reasons I need to leave home at age 12. And I made a presentation to them. And I don't know. They took me seriously enough to know that I wasn't bluffing. Like, I really did want to leave. And it was hard for me, though. And I talk about this sometimes with other people, like, having this kind of cocoon of, like, cultural formation and being in my own community amongst my own people and feeling great satisfaction from the work that I was doing there and feeling fulfilled in the cultural preservation arena, but not feeling fulfilled in my educational attainment inside. And once again, this dichotomy rears its head. I was like feeling like I had to choose between will I continue doing this kind of strenuous cultural preservation or will I leave home at such a young age and pursue education elsewhere. And I still felt that I had to get out a little bit. So I went to boarding school in East Texas for 2 years, and then in North Louisiana for 3 years. And during this time, every time I would come home, especially in the summers or for school breaks, I was always helping with the language program and the heritage department. Pretty much every summer, I would spend the entire summer volunteering for the most part for the heritage department and doing transcription work or like simple translation work or doing events for families or kids, just helping out. And so I was still able to keep my foot, or keep my foot a little bit in the water, even though I was away for so much of the year. And then when I was 17, I got into Harvard, and this was kind of my objective. Whenever I decided that I wanted to go to boarding school when I was young, I just thought it would be difficult to do that from my local public school in our little town where no one had ever done that. Maybe it would still have been possible, but it just seemed like the right thing for me to do to go on this trajectory. And I felt like I wanted to somehow continue pushing this cultural preservation experience that I had had when I went to college. And I thought about I might end up picking a fight wherever I go to college. And so Harvard seemed like a good place to go because it felt like if I was going to fight someone about native languages, this might be the place where it's most visible, where people would pay attention more than elsewhere, because it's rare for policy changes to happen at this school. So I was talking to my parents about this after I graduated and before I went. And the summer between when I graduated high school and when I started college, we had our first immersion class in Koasati. And this was like 10, 20 years in the making. And my father was the main teacher. Renella Fotno was another one of the teachers. And we would bring fluent speakers and elders into the class every day, pretty much, throughout the summer. It was 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, that kind of thing. And it was such an interesting experience because we had felt that in the intervening time from when we first started creating materials to then, which was like the summer of 2016, that we had all these nice materials, we had all these resources for kids, we had all of these little things that we felt should be contributing to people speaking more, but no movement was really happening. Some kids could count to 10 more than they could before, or a few people knew the nouns for various animals more than they did before. But nobody was really taking the step off the cliff towards fluency. I might put it that way. And it was just hard to understand why. And I think about, I took Spanish for 3 years in high school, and I think about that sometimes, or I've done things like Duolingo, or like all these other kind of like pop learning apps. And I think the difficulty with an endangered language especially is that having access to basic materials is not even close to what an immersion experience would kind of give you and saturating you in the language and giving you kind of no choice but to start picking it up. If you learn something passively in a classroom, like, even up to like I took Spanish 3, and I can't speak much Spanish to this day. And I think a lot of people end up taking language classes and feeling like they learn a little bit or they get an exposure to what the language is like, but they never go up the deep end and really start speaking the language in a legitimate way. And when you have an endangered language that doesn't have popular music or movies or media or all these other things that more well-known languages have, it's even more difficult. And when the entire culture speaks English, the dominant language, it's even more difficult. So we felt we had to create a closed universe, and it was like me and a handful of other students were like the guinea pigs for the immersion class, and it was so hard. I have to tell you, we didn't do any kind of let's do a week where we learn the basic parts of the grammar, and we might be able to have a little bit of classroom instruction before we got thrown into the pool. But they just felt we've done that. We've done it over and over again. So what's the point? Just throw them in and see if they can figure it out. And I remember feeling like a baby. That is the feeling that I had more than anything else. I remember feeling like an infant that could not express myself because they would not speak English. And I think it was a wonderful thing. All the elders would or the fluent speakers would come into the room and they would have conversations, and we're sitting there listening to them. We would maybe have flashcards or other things that people might hold up to us to try to learn some of the basic phrases or words, but we never had any translation. So it was kind of like learning from first principles. That's how I would describe it. How do you explain to a kid what a ball is? You kind of point at it and you say ball. So that was kind of we had to start there, and that's how basic and stripped down this experience was. And it brings up all sorts of funny things, how do you describe to somebody that you might say you're riding in a car or you're riding a horse, and these are two different actions, really. How do you describe that to somebody if they don't speak the language or they don't know? All these kinds of nuances. And Koasati has features that are not present in English. Sounds too, but features like in Koasati, you have to signify with an ending if the information that you're telling another person you observed yourself, or if you heard it secondhand. It's called a hearsay tense. English is so far from that there's no way to describe that to someone unless you just hear it a bunch. I mean, there were things like the verb tense changes based on the number of people doing something. And that, maybe that's more in English than I think of, but it's like to go will change 3 or 4 times depending on how many people are doing it. And all these other features that you just kind of had to have repetition, and it kind of beat it into you a little bit. And I think it was so good to have that experience when I did, because I felt, right before I went to college, I wrote my college essays on the language project and the heritage department, and growing up in this environment and doing all these things. And I remember my grandmother's words echoing in my head all the time. When I was a kid, she was happy that I was contributing to these cultural preservation things, but sometimes she would get solemn with me, and she felt disappointed and sad that I couldn't understand her at all whenever she would speak in our language. And one day she sat me down and she said to me, and a lot of elders say these kinds of things, this is not necessarily my opinion, but you hear this kind of thing a lot from first speakers of these kinds of endangered languages. She said, an Indian who can't speak his language is no Indian at all. And I felt guilt and shame and inadequacy. I said, well, it's cute. I used to think to myself, it's cute that I'm helping. But at some point, I got to put my money where my mouth is, and I've got to learn this language. And so in that immersion class that summer before I went to college, it was so hard. It was so difficult to get over the initial hurdle, which is like to become conversational, enough to be able to express yourself in very basic ways. And I remember going to elders' houses after class throughout the whole summer, and my aunt or other people, and sitting at elders' houses and genuinely, like a toddler, trying to express myself, trying to have a conversation with them, ask them a question about their life. And God bless them, they were so patient with me. But, you know, if anyone's ever learned a language from relatives, sometimes they'll make fun of you. Sometimes they'll laugh at you. Sometimes they get impatient or they get tired, so they kick you out. But this is all part of the process. And I remember sometimes going to the car and just weeping, just feeling like I'm so stupid. I'm never going to learn this language. It's impossible. It's so hard. This is why no one ever did it before. You know, kind of getting into a self-pity spiral, but then just, I still hear my dad's voice, suck it up, boy. Like, you know, get over it and keep going. And so I kept at it. By the end of the summer, I was basically conversational, which already felt kind of miraculous. And I was just like, I need to keep going. I need to keep learning, even whenever I go to Boston. And so, you know, even to this day, still spending countless hours reading the teaching grammar, reading the phrase book, reading the dictionary, you know, and elders will often tell me, you have better talk to yourself. So a lot of times I go around and I'll think to myself, how would I describe what I'm doing in Koasati? Because if you have no one with you to talk to, you have to find some way to practice. And so I go to Harvard and I'm like G'd up on this, I'm amped up. I'm like, all right, I told you people who I was, I talked about this project, I said, like, this is the thing I care the most about, this is what I'm gonna pursue while I'm here. And I get there and I'm like, my friends started to talk about placing out of language classes with Spanish or French or other languages that they took in high school. And I remember thinking to myself, I am conversational at least, going on the road towards fluency. I probably spoke more Koasati than a lot of my friends who were placing out in these other languages did of their languages. And I just thought to myself, why should I have to take Spanish placement exam or some other placement exam or take some other language class when I have spent so much time and effort learning my own language, a language that will die if people in my position or other people in the tribe don't learn it. Whereas other, you know, like European languages, they have no risk of dying if people don't learn them. It's not the same kind of time pressure. And so I just thought, there's no real reason why Native American languages are not recognized for credit at universities. I thought about this. Are Native American languages not real languages? I thought that. Is that what they think? I used to think, whenever I was talking to administrators and saying you should recognize my language for credit, I used to think, do they think that I'm making up a language and trying to get out of the language requirement? Because I guess if you're an administrator, that's something that students might do. But I have all this documentation, and there are few people from communities as small as mine who have as much of a paper trail that I'm not making this up. I am not making this language up. I am not the first person to talk about it. And so I was able to kind of convince them, like, I'm not going away and I'm not taking the back door out. I can't tell you how many people begged me to take a Spanish exam. They're like, please, like, we want you to get out of the requirement. We want to help you. We don't want to fight. Please take this back door out. And I remember thinking to myself, I will be betraying my people, the sacrifices that they've made, the thousands and thousands of people that didn't make it to Louisiana, traveling from Tennessee to Louisiana, all the generations of people that spoke the language and suffered on account of it, the people that were punished for remembering it. And I thought, am I going to take the easy road out whenever I have a chance to stand my ground and make a difference for my people, for Native Americans maybe writ large, and to put our tribe's language in the ledger of history. So I thought, no, I will not take that exam. I will not compromise. And we're going to fight about it. And that's what ended up happening. I mean, I think a lot of well-meaning people in these positions of authority. I talked to a lot of like middle manager deans and stuff. No offense if there are any in the room, but there's lots of layers to academic apparatuses and things like that. Anyone who's ever done something like creating a Native American Studies minor, for example, might be very, very familiar with that. But so it was kind of like, I don't know, it was kind of like a puzzle or something. Talk to this person, and they would send me to this person, and it felt like they were kind of giving me the runaround for a long time. And so it starts to get to the 11th hour. Every undergraduate had to have completed their language requirement by the end of their second year, or at least begun a class that would lead to the completion of that requirement. And I was 3 semesters in. I was about to be done with my 3rd semester, and I just realized I was out of time. And I thought, there's no way that I will be comfortable graduating from this school if this is not changed. I said to myself, I have to choose. I would rather not get a Harvard degree than compromise on this fight. And so I told them, we all agreed that it was probably best for me to take some time off. So I took a year off, and during this time, I kind of went home and regrouped and continued working on preservation activities and things like that. But all the allies that I had made at Harvard throughout this period, various professors and like linguistics departments and humanities and sociology and all the other kind of departments that had related interests or that I maybe had office hours one time with, or I mean anybody that I talked to that I felt like could help me, I was kind of throwing it in there. I was like, hey, I have a language that I'm trying to get recognized, and a lot of people ended up being sympathetic towards this cause, and I don't know. I had a position that sometimes felt like one that was in some ways unimpeachable. When you really explain it to somebody, how can you justify not recognizing Native American languages for credit? My only argument was that these are real languages, they matter, and they deserve to be recognized in the academy. And there is no argument, I mean truly, there is no real argument against that. You have to argue that the languages are fake, or that Indians are all gone, and these languages are already dead, or some other ahistorical crazy thing. So over time, I kind of had more support growing in the faculty, and whenever I left school, I was kind of getting reports about over time from sympathetic people who were in some of these meetings, kind of giving me status updates and stuff. And it kind of felt like me actually taking the year off and continuing to push for it and continuing to talk to media outlets and to tell them I'm ready to go public with this. This is, I mean, we can do this the easy way. And I tried to keep that as sort of a lever of last resort, but at a certain point, I was like, my education is being jeopardized by this. I mean, you have to tell me no or yes. I mean, we can't just delay this decision forever. So, and I felt like part of the tide turning, or people finally taking it more seriously, it was that, I don't know, I kind of ended up being a good victim in a way, or I don't want to put myself like that, but it felt like some of the faculty was saying, we cannot do this to this kid. This is really messed up. This person told us what he was about, what he cared about, and that was a large part of why we accepted him to the school. And we were willing to sing his praises when it was easy. We were willing to say we want to contribute to the intellectual development of people doing this kind of work when it was easy. But now that it's hard, we're pushing him away and oppressing him in all these random and arbitrary ways. And so, right before I came back to Harvard after the year off was over, I got an email, and they were like, "Hey, one of the big obstacles, there was all this technical handbook language that was kind of in the way. One of the obstacles was they needed to find a professor from a comparable university to test my skills or whatever. And they were often like, well, there's no comparable university. And I'm like, please get over yourselves. But they emailed me and they said, we have found, Eli, we're so happy. We have found a professor. And I'm like, the one that I've been recommending for 2.5 years, Jack Martin from William & Mary? What a miracle. I was amazed. I was like, wow, you really have done me a favor. And so we organized a placement exam. I sat with a tribal elder named Miranda Poncho, and we talked for like half an hour in Koasati, and I took a placement exam, a written placement exam, for a story that I had transcribed that my great-grandfather told.
Oh my.
That I memorized when I was a kid. So I thought, man, this is not the most neutral sort of assessment of myself, but yeah, of course, I mean, I passed with flying colors. I was at that point fluent. I continued learning. I was far more proficient at that point than I even was whenever I came in the first instance. So I was really happy about that. It allowed me to feel like I could be a normal college student for like the remaining 5 semesters that I had. I met my beautiful fiance at Harvard, Margaret. She's gonna be embarrassed that I'm showing her out, but and I ended up having a pretty good college experience after that. And this kind of fight made me think that it is not illegitimate activism to kind of say that institutions are illegitimate and to kind of rail against them and to not recognize that there might be some way to collaborate and change the policy of institutions, but rather to kind of rail against institutions writ large. For whatever reason, that was just never my tack. Like, I know a lot of people do that sort of thing, and I think it makes sense, especially when in this field when there's so much historical injustice and so much trauma. I mean, in some ways it's sensible to feel that institutions have nothing to offer us, but maybe it's because I was meant to be a lawyer, but I just always felt that in some ways, if you can change a policy, if you can go through suffering and difficulty and change the bylaws, change the way that institutions work, you might be able to save other people headaches in the future. You might be able to give younger students the opportunity to go further than you did. And I felt really vindicated a few years after I graduated when a young Alabama Coushatta girl, that's our sister tribe in Texas, she went to Harvard and she worked with them to send linguists and other academics to the Alabama Coushatta Reservation and to do preservation work on Alabama. And I remember getting emotional whenever I read about this because I was like, they would not even look at me for like 2 years, 2-3 years. They didn't want to talk about me. I mean, the fact that just a few years after this, they are not only willing to recognize Alabama, but to put their own resources towards preserving it. I felt like this is a major reason why these kinds of efforts end up mattering. I never needed or wanted recognition for changing this policy, but I wanted that outcome, that the next student, the next generation of Native students wouldn't feel like they had to make this, what I'm going to call a false choice. If institutions are working to their capacity, if institutions are living up to their own stated interests and values and goals, then that choice will not have to be made necessarily. I think, especially because cultural preservation, language preservation, all these things, these are really good academic exercises. These train a person in, things that people spend decades doing field work to learn, or researching to figure out these methods and things like that. And so they can be mutually reinforcing in a really positive way. And so after undergrad, it then seemed sensible to go to law school because it seemed like a way to continue kind of using my method to push for advancements in this area in other arenas. And that's why I decided to go to Georgetown, being in DC, because federal Indian law is kind of like the career path where I can do this sort of thing full time. And I used to think I don't really want to work that much, so I better find something that I can at least enjoy if I have to work. So federal Indian law seemed like a good way to bridge this divide. And I think the the takeaway that I might give to people is that over the course of my life, whenever various groups of people have talked to me, like whenever I talk to linguists, a lot of linguists were like, you should be a linguist. Whenever I talk to lawyers, lawyers would say that. Whenever I talk to pastors, pastors would say you should be a pastor. All the different kinds of groups of people that I've worked with in my life in various situations have, I've been able to see myself maybe going down that path or this path or that path. But then I thought to myself, the boxes that I refused other people to put on me when I was a kid, I have to refuse in some ways now, because I don't think that these things are mutually exclusive. I don't think of course everyone has to at some point choose a profession and figure out what they want to do with their life, but I think there's no real reason why you can't be true to your people, true to your culture, true to your heritage, and the things that matter to you personally, and pursue things that might make a positive difference in the world. There was a natural intersection for me in doing federal Indian law and kind of bridging it to cultural preservation, because federal Indian law, it contributes to the environments where languages will be preserved or diminished. It contributes to the state building capacity of tribes and their ability to fund their own efforts to do these sorts of programs and things like that. And so I was able to kind of bridge that gap a little bit. But even if you don't end up working in something that is directly relevant to your passion, I think it's important to continue doing it in your personal time. And I often tell people, why everyone feels that, especially older people in their family might they might pass before they're able to impart a lot of the knowledge or the wisdom that they have to younger generations. I tell people, if you ever get a chance, sit with your grandparent and just record on your phone and talk to them for an hour about their life or about their experiences. You'll be amazed at what you learn. And I think, especially for young Indigenous people these days, it feels like it might be illegitimate in some ways to work within the system, but I think whenever your survival is on the line and when the typical avenues have kind of scorned you in the past, I don't think that necessarily means that there's no productive path in that direction in the future. I think right now is a really exciting time in Indian country because so many tribes now are getting more resources, developing their businesses, and building out their capacity to be self-sufficient and to do the kind of cultural preservation work that they want. And I think it will be important for us as we go forward to continue rejecting these binaries and these boxes and refusing whenever people tell us you have to choose between culture and career. I think it's fair to say that that is not the true choice. That is not the only way of thinking about these things. And the old ways of doing things are not going to get us where we want to go in the future. I mean, tribes still face so many challenges, especially when it comes to federal funding and an administration can change and all of your funding for a specific project might go out the window. Of course, academics are also really familiar with that. But continuing to find ways for us to be self-sufficient and to push for the things that we need to maintain our place in this world. I think tribes all over the country, but I can only speak for my own. We have a lot to offer. We have a lot to say, and we are still here. So thank you.
Okay.
I went a little long, so I think we only have a few minutes for questions, but I'm happy to take any.
So everyone.
Yeah, where do I begin? Are the schools in your hometown where you grew up, where your grandmother lives, do they teach the native language now?
No, that's a great question though. When I was younger, part of the early phase of the language project was we were able to get a class in the local public school for a handful of the tribal kids to start learning the language. But I think it was not for credit initially, but then maybe they did some partnership with a local university, but that was short-lived, but it was like a pilot program. We had like
Grade school?
Class.
Grade school.
It was in middle school. It was like 7th grade. It was right before I left.
All right.
Yeah.
Nothing in the grade schools, the kindergartens?
No. And we've started at times in recent years thinking about language nests for like really, really little kids and some of the elders, and we've done that a little bit. But most of this kind of stuff will kind of have to be done in-house in a way.
Yeah, I was about to say because I lived in LA for a long time, and that's where children learn Spanish is in the home, and and they all grew up bilingual, because they had Spanish in the home and then English outside. But then again, you also have problems with literacy. They can speak it, they can't read it, and on and on and on. So I was curious about that.
Yeah.
Also, one more, if I may. I lived for a while in Arizona, and when I left there in about 13 or 14, the Navajo Nation there was going to elect a president for the tribe. But there was a problem because within the tribe, because half of the tribe wanted to make a stipulation that to be president of the Navajo tribe, you had to speak the language, and the other half argued that it shouldn't be a stipulation to being president of the tribe. You talk about institutions and, dealing with institutions. Do you have any comment on that?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think something that I didn't have a chance to touch on that much because it would have taken 2 hours by itself. But the internal politics of a tribe are something that outsiders rarely get a glimpse into. So it's really interesting that you're familiar with that. But I remember that situation, and I think in my tribe, in some ways, my family has historically been, at least in cultural matters, a little bit more conservative. And so, like, a stipulation like that, that's something that people in my family have talked about at times for our own tribe. Only one chairman in the history of our tribe or chief has ever not spoken the language. It was the previous chairman that is no longer in office, but it'll have to be something that I think about more over time. But I don't necessarily think it's totally necessary for there to be a law forbidding someone that doesn't speak the language from becoming an elected official, because I do believe that the people kind of will have to weigh their own values and who they choose to vote for. And I think a lot of people will have that in their mind. I will not vote for someone that doesn't speak the language because there's a lot of culture behind that. But by the same token, our chairman right now, like the role of chairman is not traditional chief. So because we have businesses, we have a casino, and we have all these other things going on, the chairman is more of a business role now. So they oversee the casino and the council, but they're not like a ceremonial head of religious rites or anything like that. So I don't think it's strictly necessary in the same way for the chairman to have to speak Koasati. But of course, when I vote, I like for someone to speak Koasati. I would prefer them to speak the language to be our head of government. But I think one of the beauties of sovereignty is that every tribe gets to make their own decision about that. And so far, we haven't chosen to put that specific law in. So that's where we're at with it. But thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Sure, thanks, Eli, for this. This is awesome. When y'all were putting together the alphabet for Koasati, did you refer to the Cherokee syllabary at all?
Definitely. The Cherokee syllabary is a really good case study in like how to produce one's own alphabet. So we thought about that. We thought about Wampanoag creating their own alphabet. We thought about a lot of different case studies in the Southwest where they're also doing that kind of thing. We looked at all the different examples of tribes creating their own alphabets, and I think the thing that we were weighing up, which I kind of touched on, was we were just trying to decide which approach we wanted to take. Did we want to create our own script or not? That was the big gate. And once we chose to not create our own script, then the pool of indigenous alphabets that we could kind of like reference in our process became narrower. Because a lot of tribes have chosen to make their own alphabets, but they were all instructive in just showing the different ways that it was possible to do this. And I think it's really cool that so many tribes have different ways of doing it. We definitely thought, like, the barrier to entry being lower would be best for our specific case. But there's also trade-offs with that. Like, for example, earlier I was doing storytelling with kids and looking at the written language, and there's a lot of sounds that you might mistake because they look like it's spelled THO, and so you think that's the English pronunciation. But a lot of our alphabet, they signifies different sounds. So like that TH sound would be like not, and so that kind of becomes a barrier a little bit in some ways to whenever you're teaching people that read and write English. They have to kind of unlearn some of those associations. So there are trade-offs there too. So there's positives and negatives to all of those different approaches. But yeah, definitely the Cherokee syllabary was influential. Sure. Sure. Achikano, anak Cholchifo, Eli Langley ka. Achiopaho Sachi Chalekianita, Alida Mohastak. So I said, hey, everybody, I'm Eli Langley. Welcome. Thanks for coming, and I'm glad you're here.
Okay.
One more question. Thank you so much for being here. It's a really great presentation. When you first started learning the language, did you have the foresight that you wanted your future work in activism to intersect with language, or did that come unplanned as a result of learning the language?
I think I was so immersed in the process in the first instance that I didn't really think about what all the implications might be for the future until later. I didn't even necessarily know for sure that I wanted to go to law school until senior year of college. I didn't even know for sure that federal Indian law was its own field until I went to that Pre-Law Summer Institute and learned that. So I think it was like a progressive process of figuring out, I like this thing, this is a possible professional avenue to kind of pursue this area of interest, and just over time, I kind of like more pieces fell into place. And I say where I am today, and I think, wow, it's really lucky in some ways that I was able to figure out that this kind of job even exists, and let alone kind of be in a position now to practice in this area. It feels like a real blessing. So, thank you.
I think with that, we will wrap it up, and I hope you'll join us upstairs for a few refreshments and a little more conversation. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Eli.